Hi there, and welcome to Israel Explained. This edition is under the shadow of the terrible tragedy of the six hostages who were killed in Gaza. The six of whom are, of course, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, 23 years old, Eden Yerushalmi, 24 years old, Orin Danino, 25 years old, Alex Lubnov, 32 years old, Carmel Gat, 40 years old, and Almog Sarusi, 27 years old, who were murdered by Hamas on the night between Thursday and Friday. The exact circumstances in which they were murdered are not clear. Um, they wanted to kill them before the IDF rescued them. It's not clear how close the IDF was rescuing them. And the reason that matters is because if they're doing preemptive murders now without the IDF being very close, that of course has clear consequences for the safety of the hostages. Hamas has announced that its new policy is to kill hostages um, and they said that they are doing that in order to make sure that Israel can't rescue any hostages and get them out in any way aside from a deal. And they've released memes showing Hamas soldiers, terrorists about to kill hostages. It's all been very, very disturbing. And whatever concerns we had about the safety of the hostages until Thursday, which were incredibly high, now they've been compounded, and it's reaching fever pitch. There's real reasons for concern that it won't be long before there's very few, if any, hostages left alive, which, of course, the Israeli people, myself, anyone following this has found very, very disturbing. And a lot of people in Israel, certainly not all of them, have been blaming Netanyahu for this. Not because Israel is the one that executed the hostages, of course, but because there's a feeling that some of the changes that Netanyahu made in the negotiations over the last 2 months have made it impossible to reach a deal. Now, let's discuss those changes. Before I start discussing those changes, I want to say very clearly that even though Netanyahu's negotiation tactics are part of the problem, it's really not clear, and this has to be said, that Hamas actually wants a deal. And there have been indications that Sinwar, who's the only person in charge now, after the assassination of Hania and Khaled Mashal being sidelined, doesn't want a deal because he's waiting to see if the other fronts will expand. So that's an important caveat to put there. So when Israeli security experts, Israeli citizens blaming Netanyahu, what they're saying is what he's doing is making it less likely for there to be a deal. No one can really say with any certainty that if he wasn't making these maneuvers, there would be a deal. And that's a very important thing to say before I start. But let's look at some of the changes that Netanyahu has made. So as we remember, there was on May 27th, the Israeli cabinet approved an offer, which Israel then backed away from somewhat, and Biden brought to the UN Security Council, and so on and so forth. Since then, and after Israel sort of accepted its own offer after some pressure, on July 27th, Israel released what it called a clarifications document, which really was a complete change to that offer. Just today on Ynet, that document was revealed. They actually have possession of the document, not just leaks, they have pictures of the document there. So here are some of the changes that were made. The May 27th offer states that there should be a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, and it also had a timeline for that withdrawal. The July 27th document changes that in several ways. It calls for a continued control of the Philadelphi Corridor. It also calls for continued control of a kilometer.4 strip on the border between Gaza and Israel, a security zone. None of that is included in the original offer, and for Hamas, that's generally considered to be a non-starter. The most important thing to them is that Israel withdraw completely from Gaza for there to be a ceasefire. And that's why this element, with a focus on the Philadelphi corridor, less on the security area, has been the main talking point that everyone is focusing on. But that's not the only thing. Of course, the May 27th offer said that armed Palestinians should not return to the north, but it didn't have a mechanism to stop that. Meanwhile, the July 27th document demanded that a mechanism be created in order to stop that. People are talking about that less because Israel seems to have backed away from that condition, at least somewhat. The May 27th offer called for the exile of the most dangerous terrorists released to either Gaza or abroad. The July 27th version said they should only go abroad. It also seems to have doubled the number of prisoners exiled from 100 to 200. Now, that is a change of terms, but Hamas seems to have agreed to that. Hamas' position appears to be they'll accept that if Israel removes the demand regarding Philadelphia. That was another change that Netanyahu did. Final change, the most minor one, but still one with some significance. In the May 27th offer, Israel agreed to open the Rafah crossing. It says that clearly in that offer. The July 27th offer says, quote, arrangements will be made to open the crossing, end quote. That removes the guarantee. That says that the arrangements will be made. Subtle difference, which gives Israel some plausible deniability. Hamas doesn't want Israel to have that plausible deniability. A look at these changes makes the problem pretty clear. You can justify every one of these changes as reasonable. You can even justify all the changes as reasonable. But it's broad enough to make the deal much less desirable for Hamas and much less likely to agree to a deal. That's why a security source told Ynet on the same article where they showed these changes and referring to these changes, this document is stained with the blood of the 6 hostages. Without this document, there's a good chance they would have been released a month ago and would be with us here now, end quote. Now, you've probably all seen Netanyahu's press conference, which focused on one thing and one thing only after the death of the hostages. On why the Philadelphi Corridor is something that Israel absolutely cannot withdraw from. He made it seem like the Philadelphi Corridor is the most important element for Israeli security. And without a doubt, it is very important. When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, I thought it was a big mistake to withdraw from Philadelphi Corridor. I was very young at the time. I was in my 20s, but I already knew enough to know that that was a big mistake. And when Israel took over the Philadelphia Corridor, I was very happy because it provides Israel with a lot of leverage and also is the best way for Israel to prevent arms from being smuggled from Egypt into Gaza is by holding on to the Philadelphia Corridor. That the Rafah crossing in particular, but also the tunnels underneath. And by the way, security sources tell me that the Rafah crossing is more important, that more arms came through that than the tunnels, are crucial for stopping arms from coming into Hamas in Gaza. There's no question about that. It's a very important security interest. But most Israeli experts believe that it's one that Israel can overcome, and it's one that Israel should trade away in order to get the hostages back and get a ceasefire deal right now. Benny Gantz, the former defense minister, former chief of staff, former member of the war cabinet in this war, gave a press conference to that effect. It was a quite devastating speech. He said, we will have to return to the Philadelphia corridor when necessary, just as we maneuvered into Gaza, just as we went to a proposal for bringing the hostage back when he played for time, just as we returned to fighting when it was necessary after the previous deal, that is precisely how we will return to the Philadelphia corridor, if and when we must, just as we returned to Zaytun and Khan Yunis and every other place. End quote. Now, in his speech, Netanyahu said that once Israel withdraws, they won't be able to go back because of international pressure. And Gantz countered that. He said, quote, if Netanyahu is not strong enough to stand up to international pressure against returning to Rafah, he should resign and head home. He continued, the story is not Philadelphia, but the lack of true strategic decisions. And in that, I absolutely agree with Gantz. Gantz also says that the Philadelphia corridor is not an existential threat, the way Netanyahu makes it out to be. Instead, he says Iran and its axis of proxies and allies pose the real danger and should be the focus of Israel's military attention. Quote, the important thing is that we reach a deal to bring the hostages home and implement it. We must ensure that an underground barrier is built along the Philadelphi Corridor and internalize that we have to release damned murderers, end quote. He concluded the speech by telling Netanyahu that he is, quote, no longer capable of confronting the real existential threat, end quote. And the security measures that are being offered in the deal by the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, etc. Most Israeli security experts, the former chiefs of staff, the current chief of staff, heads of Mossad, former, current, Shin Bet, etc., all think that they're sufficient, not great, but sufficient, and enough for Israel to agree to a deal. Netanyahu is definitely in the minority there, and also, let's be honest, he doesn't have the same security credentials. He's never been chief of staff or anything like that. Now, some of the mediators told CNN that the speech that Netanyahu gave kills the possibility of hostage deal. I don't think that's true. I think that maybe if he never backs down from it, then it kills the deal. But Netanyahu could back down from it. He's backed down from a lot of things. He staked a lot of his reputation on the speech by making it so long, so public, and so focused on that one issue. So that's a problem. But that doesn't mean that he can't theoretically back out of it. So the talks continue. They don't look very promising. But the United States is expected to introduce its final proposal in a take it or leave it format within the next few days. I've said that before, but the U.S. delayed it, and I hope that they actually release it. But of course, they have to do enough preliminary work to try to get Hamas and Israel to agree to the deal before they release it. So that's, of course, been a delay, and Netanyahu's speeches haven't helped with that delay. Take it or leave it, of course, has the advantage of putting the parties on the spot that they might be blamed for saying no. So hopefully that will lead to a deal. More likely, it will give us some clarity on who the main obstacle to the deal is. I really hope that Israel says yes as a patriotic Israeli, because A, I think it's time for a deal, but B, if there's not going to be a deal, at least let's have Hamas be blamed for not having a deal. But one of the reasons Hamas may not agree to a deal, and one of the reasons Israel does need a deal, is because the war is actually getting worse in so many ways. A security source leaked, quote, Hamas managed to restore its capabilities in the northern Gaza Strip. According to estimates, there are currently about 3,000 operatives who have returned to operating in the northern Gaza Strip. So just the north alone, 3,000. On top of that, Netzarim checkpoint that Israel has created, Hamas is managing to rebuild there because it's unable to stop the smuggling of arms, smuggling of terrorists into there. These are new terrorists recruited by the terrorist organization recently, not terrorists who moved from the south of the Gaza Strip to the north, although there are those as well. According to senior officials in the security system, quote, there will be no escape from a renewed and massive entry of IDF forces into the northern Gaza Strip, end quote. And that really shows that all these months of operation have achieved very little. A lot of terrorists were killed in the northern Gaza Strip. A lot of civilians were killed. But Hamas's ability to rule that area, the area that Israel has locked off, has not been removed. It's been dented. It's been challenged. It's not been removed. All of Gaza remains under, except for where Israel is, remains under Hamas control. And meanwhile, the West Bank is getting a lot worse. And I think this is the most important element of the conflict right now, strategically speaking. And it's not getting enough attention. But the West Bank is becoming a more and more intense front. In fact, the whole idea that this is a war in Gaza, I believe, is no longer relevant. Because sure, there's fighting going on in Gaza still, but the fighting going on in the West Bank is just as intense. The firing in the north is on Israeli territory is just as intense, more intense. So you can't really look at it as a Gaza war anymore. It's spread, it's expanded. That's one of the reasons that Sinwar is not desperate for a deal. So the IDF currently has 23 battalions in the West Bank. That's more than the 7 three times as much as the 7 that they have in Gaza. They're fighting every day, just like they're fighting in Gaza. More units are going to move there because they're needed there. And they're operating at a higher intensity most nights, not every night. The IDF is also reporting some very concerning things. They're finding labs for explosives. And also, Khalid Mashal, who's, I guess, now the number 2 in Hamas, said very clearly that Hamas's policy is to bring back the suicide bombings that so terrorized Israel from the mid 1990s until 2005. They don't yet have the ability to carry out those big ones that they had in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv back in the day, but we have seen several attacks in the West Bank of booby-trapped cars and other bombs exploding, including one that killed 3 police officers that are very concerning. A lot of people in the IDF and in the Shin Bet believe it won't be long before Hamas is able to launch more concrete suicide attacks inside the Green Line. They're already able to do it and kill settlers, which is very, very alarming. Um, Jenin and Tulkarem are the 2 cities where the PA was thrown out by terrorists a few years ago and now have taken over. And that's where this all started. But now they're also finding that this is happening in Hebron, a city which had been pacified. And it might spread to other cities. Soon the whole West Bank could be a hornet's nest of terrorism. Of course, the West Bank is much bigger than Gaza, and there's settlements everywhere, meaning that it's hard to have a front line. It's hard to defend citizens in any meaningful way. The fence that Israel built so many years ago with a lot of fanfare was never completed. So the security risks in the West Bank are terrible. Of course, if they can shoot rockets from there, they might be able to hit the airport. So the vulnerability from the West Bank is horrible. The weakening of the PA is making it actually much worse than it would have been. There's still 2 mediating factors. One is the PA still fights this where it can, especially where it's strong in Ramallah, Jericho, a few other places, but they can't where they're weak. And they certainly can't where they don't exist, where they've been thrown out by terrorists. Second, most Palestinians in the West Bank, by all accounts, do not support the reconstituting of the major terrorist networks in the West Bank. They're still quite small. We're not talking about thousands like we are in Gaza. We're talking about hundreds in each city. 100, 200, 300, less than 500 in each city. But that, of course, is being challenged by the expansion of settlements, settler terrorism, the continuing war in Gaza, and so on and so forth. It's not clear that that situation will actually continue. So the IDF is concerned that the escalation in the West Bank will come at the expense of the war in Gaza and the expense of bringing security back to the north. So what we have here is a massive strategic deterioration for Israel that I don't think most people are paying enough attention to. So to bring this all back full circle, the Philadelphi Corridor is not unimportant. It's very important. It's a strategic asset to Israel. But keeping it won't provide perfect protection against smuggling arms into Gaza, as we can see from what's happening in the West Bank, where arms are coming in, from the inability to stop Hamas from reconstituting in the north of the Strip. And Israel could theoretically go back. What it can't do is it can't get the hostages to reanimate. Once they're dead, they're dead. And just as importantly, Israel doesn't seem to have any answers to the deterioration of the strategic situation in the West Bank and Lebanon. So right now, the war is not playing into Israel's hands. The continuation is not playing into Israel's hands. I don't think a Philadelphia corridor for its more tactical than strategic advantages is really worth this continuing. Ultimately, it's a band-aid to stop smuggling arms. The solution to the problems that Israel is facing, the solutions are political. They require removing Hamas. They require creating a new Palestinian government. They require normalizing with Saudi Arabia and creating a wider anti-Iranian alliance. The Philadelphia Corridor is at best a band-aid. Israel is facing a metastasizing cancer of terrorism, Iran-sponsored terrorism, which it can only fight with chemotherapy, and that chemotherapy has to have a political component. Just remember the wise words of Clausewitz, war is a continuation of politics by other means. And the goal has to be political, not military, not stopping arms from coming in, not killing terrorists, but creating a different political reality on the ground that is more favorable to Israel. Okay, that's the end of this episode. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Also consider following my history podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast, where I'm working on the early days of the Kingdom of Israel and what the Book of Kings gets wrong about the Kingdom of Israel. I will see you here next time something interesting happens.